The summer of 1944 hung heavy over Fort Knox, Kentucky, where the smell of diesel fuel and freshly cut grass mixed with the metallic tang of artillery shells. Lieutenant James Mitchell stood in the shadow of an old cattle shed on the edge of the training grounds, watching M4 Sherman tanks rumble past like iron elephants. At 26, he was considered too old by some, too inexperienced by others, and too damn stubborn by everyone who knew him. James had grown up on a ranch in Montana, where his father taught him that observation beats force 9 times out of 10. You don't chase a spooked horse, you watch where it wants to go. You don't fight a winter storm, you read the clouds and prepare. That philosophy had kept their ranch profitable during the Depression while neighbors lost everything. Now, James wanted to apply that same wisdom to warfare. The cattle shed had become his obsession. Standing 3 stories tall with a hayloft that offered a panoramic view of the entire training valley, it was the perfect observation post. James had spent 3 weeks documenting how the elevated position could coordinate artillery fire with devastating precision. His handwritten reports, filled with diagrams and calculations, sat in a folder growing thicker by the day. Colonel Harrison Blackwell commanded the base with an iron fist wrapped in academy polish. He had graduated West Point in 1920, fought in the trenches of France, and believed in doctrine the way some men believed in God. When James first presented his cattle shed proposal, Blackwell had barely glanced at it. "This is not how the United States Army operates, Lieutenant. We have established procedures. Forward observers stay with their units. They do not perch in barns like chickens waiting for foxes. But sir, the elevation gives us..." "Dismissed, Lieutenant, and stay away from that shed. It is off-limits for military operations. Do I make myself clear?" James had saluted and left, but the idea would not leave him alone. Every night in the officers' barracks, he lay awake calculating trajectories, imagining how quickly he could call in coordinates from that height. While other lieutenants played cards or wrote letters home, James sketched firing solutions on whatever paper he could find. His only ally was Sergeant Eddie Rodriguez from El Paso, Texas, a forward artillery observer who had survived North Africa and Sicily. Eddie had seen enough combat to know that innovation kept you alive longer than tradition. He had been the one to first climb the cattle shed with James, and his eyes had gone wide when he saw the view. "Holy Mother of God, Lieutenant, from up here you could see everything. Every approach, every depression, every piece of cover. You could direct fire like conducting an orchestra." "Exactly. But Blackwell will not listen." "Then maybe Blackwell needs to see it instead of hearing about it." "But how could they demonstrate something they were forbidden to use?" The answer came during a conversation James overheard in the mess hall. A special training exercise was scheduled for the last week of August. Tank units from 3 different bases would converge on Fort Knox for large-scale maneuvers. Observers from the War Department would attend. More importantly, Colonel Blackwell would be trying to impress his superiors. James made his decision on a Tuesday night while rain hammered the barracks roof. He would use the exercise to prove his point, orders or no orders. It was a career-ending gamble, but he had not joined the army to play it safe. His brother had died at Kasserine Pass because American forces had been outmaneuvered by Rommel's Afrika Korps. Better tactics might have saved him. Eddie agreed to help, though he made James promise to take full responsibility if things went south. They began sneaking equipment into the cattle shed after dark. Radio gear, binoculars, maps, rangefinders. James even borrowed surveying equipment from the engineering corps, claiming he needed it for a personal project. The night before the exercise, James barely slept. He reviewed his calculations one final time, checking and rechecking the math. The shed offered a view of approximately 4 square miles of terrain. From that vantage point, he could coordinate fire from multiple batteries simultaneously, something nearly impossible from ground level where observers could only see their immediate vicinity. As dawn broke on exercise day, James and Eddie were already in position. Below them, tank columns began moving into their starting positions. Through his binoculars, James could see Colonel Blackwell standing beside a group of men in civilian clothes. The War Department observers had arrived. The exercise was simple in concept. The tanks would attempt to push through a defensive corridor while artillery tried to stop them. Normally, this resulted in chaos as different observer teams tried to coordinate fire, often calling shots on targets other teams had already engaged. James keyed his radio using a frequency he was not authorized to be on. "This is Cattleman to all battery positions. I have eyes on the entire field. Await my coordinates." The response was immediate and hostile. "Cattleman, identify yourself. Who authorized this frequency?" James took a deep breath. There was no turning back now. Authorization does not matter. "In 6 minutes, I am going to show you why it should have." The radio exploded with angry voices. Colonel Blackwell's command post demanded James identify himself immediately. Battery commanders wanted to know who was issuing unauthorized orders. The chaos was exactly what James had predicted would happen without centralized observation. "Lieutenant Mitchell, this is Colonel Blackwell. You are ordered to vacate that position immediately and report to my office. This is a direct order." James ignored the radio and focused his binoculars on the valley below. 9M4 Sherman tanks configured to simulate German Panzers were advancing in a wedge formation through the western corridor. They moved with textbook precision, using terrain features for cover exactly as Rommel's units had done in North Africa. Eddie looked nervous beside him, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "Lieutenant, maybe we should watch the lead tank. He is going to crest that ridge in 15 seconds and expose his entire flank." James keyed the radio again, his voice calm and measured. "Battery 3, target bearing 270, range 1400 meters, lead tank cresting ridge. Fire for effect. You are not authorized to fire now or lose your shot." There was a pause that felt like an eternity. Then the distinctive thump of M101 howitzers echoed across the valley. James counted the seconds. The shells arced through the morning sky, their trajectory perfectly calculated from his elevated position. The first round landed 15 meters short. James had anticipated this. "Battery 3, add 50 meters, fire for effect." The second volley was perfect. White smoke markers erupted around the lead tank, indicating a direct hit in the exercise's scoring system. Before the tank commander could react, James was already calling the next target. "Battery 1, 2 tanks entering the draw at coordinates Hotel 7. They think they have cover, but you have enfilade from the northeast. Bearing 045, range 1200. Fire when ready. Lieutenant Mitchell, cease operations immediately." Battery 2, 3 tanks bunched together near the barn at coordinates Golf 4. "Prepare for concentration fire on my mark." Down below, the exercise was turning into a slaughter. James could see everything from his perch. Every movement, every tactical decision, every mistake the tank commanders made was visible to him. He directed fire with surgical precision, coordinating 3 different batteries in a deadly ballet that would have been impossible from ground level. The simulated Panzers tried to adapt. They scattered, seeking cover in tree lines and behind buildings. But James had studied this terrain for weeks. He knew every depression, every blind spot, every piece of concealment. More importantly, he could see what the individual battery observers on the ground could not, the overall pattern of movement. For minutes had passed. 5 tanks were already marked as destroyed. The remaining 4 were frantically trying to retreat, but James had anticipated that too. Battery 1 and 3, prepare blocking fire on the eastern road. They have nowhere else to go. Coordinates follow. A jeep was racing toward the cattle shed, dust billowing behind it. James could see Colonel Blackwell standing in the passenger seat, his face purple with rage even from this distance. Eddie gripped his shoulder. "Lieutenant, he is coming. We are done." James smiled grimly, never taking his eyes off the valley. "Not yet. Watch this." The remaining 4 tanks made their fatal mistake. Instead of scattering in different directions, they grouped together for mutual support, exactly as German doctrine taught. It was a textbook maneuver that would have worked against conventional observation. But James was not conventional. Battery 2 fire mission. 4 tanks concentrated at coordinates Foxtrot 9. This is your moment. All guns, Fire for effect. The radio crackled with acknowledgement. 6 howitzers spoke as one, their shells screaming across the sky in a coordinated barrage that would have made any artillery officer weep with pride. James had timed it perfectly. The tanks had just entered a shallow depression where they thought they had cover, but from his elevated position, he could see them as clearly as pieces on a chessboard. White smoke erupted across the depression in a devastating pattern. For direct hits, for more destroyed tanks. 9 Panzers eliminated in 6 minutes flat. The valley fell silent. Even the angry voices on the radio had stopped. James lowered his binoculars and finally allowed himself to breathe. Beside him, Eddie was staring at the scene below with his mouth open. Mother of God, I have never seen anything like that. The jeep skidded to a halt at the base of the cattle shed. Colonel Blackwell leaped out before it fully stopped, his face a mask of fury. 2 military police officers followed him. James could hear boots pounding up the wooden stairs. We are about to get court-martialed, Eddie said quietly. Maybe, but they saw it work. The door burst open. Colonel Blackwell stood in the entrance, his chest heaving, fists clenched at his sides. Behind him, the MP officers waited for orders to arrest James. For a long moment nobody spoke. James stood at attention, ready to accept whatever punishment came. Then one of the civilian observers appeared at the top of the stairs, breathing hard from the climb. He was an older man with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He pushed past Blackwell and walked to the window, looking out over the valley where smoke markers still drifted in the morning breeze. Colonel Blackwell, the man said slowly, his voice carrying authority that made even Blackwell pause. I need the name of this officer, and I need it now. James felt his stomach drop. This was it. His career was over. But before anyone could speak, the civilian turned from the window, and James saw something unexpected in his expression. It was not anger. It was recognition. If you are watching this story and wondering what happened next, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what this observer said in the next 30 seconds changed everything, not just for James, but for how the United States Army would fight for the rest of the war. The real turning point is just beginning. The civilian observer extended his hand toward James. General Theodore Hastings, War Department Strategic Operations. That was the most impressive display of coordinated fire I have witnessed since the Meuse-Argonne offensive in 1918. James shook the hand numbly, barely able to process what was happening. Behind General Hastings, Colonel Blackwell looked like he had swallowed a live grenade. Sir, this officer directly violated my orders. He commandeered an unauthorized position and disrupted a scheduled exercise without permission. He won the exercise, Blackwell. Hastings turned back to James. How long have you been developing this technique, Lieutenant? 3 weeks of observation, sir. But the principles come from ranch work in Montana. Elevated observation allows you to see patterns that ground-level observers miss. You can coordinate multiple units because you understand the complete tactical picture. Hastings nodded slowly, his mind clearly racing through implications. The Germans have been using this exact advantage in North Africa and Italy. Their observers position themselves on high ground and direct fire with devastating accuracy. We have been losing men because our doctrine keeps observers tied to their units at ground level. He turned to Blackwell. Colonel, how many casualties did the simulated Panzer unit inflict during this exercise? Blackwell's jaw tightened. None, sir. They were eliminated before achieving firing positions. And in previous exercises using standard observation methods. Blackwell hesitated. Approximately 40% casualties among our defensive forces before the enemy was neutralized. Hastings let that number hang in the air. 40%. That meant in a real battle, nearly half the men would die or be wounded because observation doctrine had not adapted to modern warfare. Lieutenant Mitchell, you are either going to be court-martialed or promoted. Possibly both. He smiled grimly. Pack your gear. You are coming to Washington with me tomorrow. The chiefs of staff need to see this. The next 3 months transformed James from a rebellious lieutenant into the architect of a new tactical doctrine. In Washington, he demonstrated his techniques to increasingly senior officers. Some resisted, clinging to traditional methods. Others, especially those who had seen combat, recognized the potential immediately. By December 1944, the first official forward observer towers were being constructed across Europe. They were not elegant structures, just elevated platforms that gave observers the height advantage James had discovered in a Kentucky cattle shed. But they worked. Reports began filtering back from the front lines. Artillery accuracy increased by 60%. Casualty rates among defensive forces dropped dramatically. Tank units that had been decimating Allied positions suddenly found themselves unable to maneuver without being caught in precisely coordinated fire. In January 1945, James shipped out to Europe with the rank of captain. His assignment was to train artillery observers in the new elevated observation techniques. He arrived in Belgium 3 weeks after the Battle of the Bulge had ended, where the need for better coordination had cost thousands of lives. His brother's death at Kasserine Pass had taught him that innovation saves lives. Now he had proof. The Belgian winter bit through every layer of clothing, but James barely noticed the cold. He stood atop a hastily constructed observation tower overlooking the Rohr River Valley, watching German positions through his binoculars. This was no longer a training exercise. Real lives depended on what he saw. "Captain Mitchell, we have movement in Sector 7. 3 vehicles, possibly armor." James swung his binoculars toward the coordinates his assistant called out. Through the morning fog, he spotted them immediately. Not tanks, but half-tracks carrying infantry toward what they thought was a blind approach to American lines. Battery positions 4 and 6, target coordinates as follows. He rattled off the numbers with the calm precision that had become his trademark. "Fire for effect on my mark." The response was immediate and professional. These crews had trained under his methods. They trusted the elevated observer to see what they could not. Mark. The shells found their targets with brutal efficiency. The half-tracks never reached American lines. More importantly, the infantry inside never had a chance to assault positions where James's fellow soldiers waited. He had just saved dozens of lives, maybe more. Over the next 4 months, James moved with the Allied advance deeper into Germany. His observation towers became a standard feature of every major operation. Other officers, inspired by his success, began developing their own innovations. The rigid doctrine that had nearly ended his career was giving way to adaptability and creative thinking. In April 1945, as Allied forces pushed toward Berlin, James received a letter from General Hastings. It was brief and to the point. "Captain Mitchell, your cattle shed gamble has been credited with saving an estimated 4,000 Allied lives through improved artillery coordination. The techniques you pioneered are now standard doctrine across all theaters of operation. Colonel Blackwell sends his regards. He has personally recommended you for the Legion of Merit. Turns out even old dogs can learn new tricks when the evidence is overwhelming enough." James read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket. 4,000 lives. The number seemed impossible, yet the data supported it. Artillery units using elevated observation consistently performed better than those using traditional methods. The difference was not marginal. It was transformational. Eddie found him that evening, grinning ear to ear. "Did you hear, Captain? They are naming the new observation doctrine after you. The Mitchell method. You are going to be in the training manuals." James shook his head, a slight smile crossing his weathered face. "They should name it after my father. He was the one who taught me that watching beats rushing. I just applied ranch wisdom to warfare. Your father taught you to watch cattle, not coordinate artillery strikes that destroy Panzer divisions. Same principle, Eddie. Same principle." The war in Europe ended 3 weeks later. James stood in the rubble of a German town whose name he could not pronounce, watching soldiers celebrate around him. He thought about his brother, about the cattle shed in Kentucky, about the moment he decided to risk everything on an idea everyone said would not work. Sometimes the greatest victories come from refusing to accept that things must stay the way they have always been. September 1950. Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell stood before a class of 200 young officers, the afternoon sun streaming through the tall windows of the lecture hall. His uniform bore the ribbons of a man who had seen real combat, including the Legion of Merit that Colonel Blackwell had indeed recommended all those years ago. The cattle shed incident had become legendary in artillery circles, taught as a case study in tactical innovation and calculated risk-taking. What the textbooks did not capture was the fear James had felt that morning, or the very real possibility that his career could have ended in disgrace rather than commendation. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying to the back of the hall, "doctrine exists for good reasons. It represents the accumulated wisdom of generations of soldiers. But doctrine that cannot adapt becomes a coffin for the men who follow it blindly." He clicked to the next slide, showing before and after statistics from the elevated observation techniques implemented during the war. 4,000 lives saved. 60% improvement in artillery accuracy. These numbers represent fathers who came home to their children, brothers who survived to see their sisters again, sons who lived to take care of aging parents. He paused, letting the weight of those words settle. That is what innovation means in warfare. Not glory, not medals, not having your name in a manual. It means people survive who otherwise would not have. After the lecture, a young lieutenant approached him nervously. "Sir, I have an idea about tank tactics that goes against current doctrine. But I am afraid to present it because my commanding officer is very traditional." James smiled, remembering a younger version of himself standing in Colonel Blackwell's office. "Is your idea sound? Have you tested it, documented it, proven it works?" "Yes, sir. I have spent 6 months developing the concept." "Then present it properly through channels with respect for the chain of command. But if they refuse to listen, and you truly believe it will save lives, then you have a choice to make." He placed a hand on the young officer's shoulder. "Just make sure you are willing to accept the consequences either way." That evening, James sat on the porch of his quarters, watching the Kansas sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Eddie, now a major himself, sat beside him with 2 glasses of bourbon. "You ever regret it?" Eddie asked. "That morning in the cattle shed?" "Every day," James said quietly. Then he smiled. And not once. His father had passed away the previous winter, but not before seeing his son's techniques adopted by armies around the world. The old rancher had simply nodded when James explained how ranch observation principles had transformed military doctrine. "Told you watching beats rushing," his father had said. "Took the whole damn army to figure out what we knew on the ranch." James raised his glass to the sunset, to his father, to his brother who never came home, and to all the soldiers who had survived because someone dared to challenge the way things had always been done. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not with guns, but with the courage to see things differently.